The millionaire CEO entered the wrong room on a cruise ship and was shocked to see the woman he once loved with two identical twin children. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Nicole stood in the bustling cruise terminal with her heart beating in her ears. Her hands felt clammy as she clutched 3 tickets and guided her 7-year-old twin boys through the crowd. She had spent the past year scrimping and saving for this trip, determined to create the kind of memory that might make up for all the questions about their father she could never quite answer. Overhead, the intercom announced departure times, and the twins, their sandy blonde heads swiveling in every direction, couldn't contain their excitement. "There it is, Mom!" cried one of them, pointing through the glass wall at the immense white cruise ship anchored in the harbor. His brother stood on tiptoe and let out a gasp of amazement. It was exactly the reaction Nicole had dreamed of seeing on her children's faces, and for a moment, their excitement settled the anxious flutter in her chest. She reached into her purse, quickly checking her phone to confirm that her account wouldn't be overdrawn from this last-minute expense. A tight knot formed in her stomach as she saw how close she was to zero. Yet when she glanced at her boys' bright eyes and heard their happy chatter, the sacrifice felt worth it. She discreetly locked her phone and smiled, putting on the confident face she always wore for them. A few yards away, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a tall man with silver-gold hair, dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. Jared. He strode forward with practiced ease, ignoring the stares of curious onlookers. An assistant followed closely behind, muttering about schedule changes and cabin arrangements. Jared nodded, only half listening. He was here for a business deal that promised to expand his empire across international markets, and nothing could be allowed to go wrong. The twins fidgeted by Nicole's side as the line moved forward. She didn't have time to notice the man in the suit skipping the line to enter through a private VIP lane. Her focus was on getting the boys on board without losing track of luggage or passports. Finally, they reached the registration counter, where the boys hopped from one foot to the other in anticipation. Nicole tried to force away the lingering anxiety and replaced it with a determined smile. Inside, the ship was even more impressive. Gleaming floors, soaring ceilings, and vibrant decor surrounded them. Nicole guided the boys through the reception area, following the signs for passenger cabins. The children pointed at every shimmering detail, from chandeliers to oversized porthole windows, while Nicole's heart fluttered at the thought of how much it must have cost to build a floating palace like this. In a different corridor, Jared stepped into his spacious stateroom, a suite that opened onto a private balcony. He nodded approvingly at the polished furniture and the tasteful art on the walls. His assistant was droning on about a meeting room mix-up. They'd have to confirm with the onboard staff which suite was designated for tonight's big discussion. The possibility of confusion irritated Jared, but he set his jaw, determined to keep everything in order. He had no idea that just a few decks away was the woman whose memory still lurked at the back of his mind, attached to old guilt and missed opportunities. Nicole and the twins found their cabin on a lower deck. It was small, but the bright bedspreads and a circular window that revealed the vast expanse of water made the space feel cozy. The boys scrambled to pick their beds, bouncing on the mattresses with gleeful giggles. Nicole reminded them to be gentle. There were other passengers around, but truthfully she loved seeing them so excited. She hoped this trip could distract them from questions about the father who'd never been around. Though she tried not to think about him, the memory sometimes slipped into her mind at odd moments, especially on nights when she could almost remember the warmth of his presence and the last look he gave her before leaving. Shaking off that old hurt, she helped the twins unpack a few essentials, folded away their clothes, and led them to the ship's upper decks to explore. Upstairs, the boys stood in awe at the giant water slide twisting above the pool. They rushed to the edge, watching vacationers splash around as a live band played near the bar. Nicole reminded them not to lean over too far, and they promised to wait until later, once they'd settled in. From across the pool area, Jared walked by with his phone pressed to his ear, discussing the final points of his upcoming meeting. He was too deep in conversation to notice the mother and two children laughing together by the railing, and Nicole, turning away from the pool to rummage in her bag for sunscreen, never lifted her head to see who had just passed. A cool ocean breeze flowed over the deck as evening approached, and Nicole decided to take the boys to the buffet. She figured filling their bellies with something hearty would help them sleep well after such an exciting day. They found an open table among the crowd. The aroma of various cuisines drifted through the air, and the twins' eyes lit up at the sight of trays loaded with colorful desserts. Nicole made them promise to eat dinner first, before indulging in sweets. At a different corner of the same buffet area, a woman was whispering excitedly to a friend. "They say some big-shot CEO is on board," she said, glancing around as if she might spot him at any moment. Nicole caught bits of the conversation but dismissed it. She was too busy helping the boys pile noodles, chicken strips, and veggies onto their plates. After dinner, Nicole guided them back through the corridors to their cabin. The ship had begun to move, and the gentle sway under their feet made the twins laugh as they tried to keep their balance. Once inside, Nicole helped them change into pajamas, then tucked them in. The moon shone through the little porthole, illuminating their soft blonde hair as they drifted off, still talking about the pool and the water slide. She lingered by the window, letting her thoughts wander to the father they never knew. It had been so many years since she'd felt that sense of hope and heartbreak all in the same breath. With a heavy sigh, she closed the window's curtain and kissed each boy's forehead. They were safe and happy right now, and for her that was all that mattered. Meanwhile, Jared left his suite on the upper deck, phone in hand, glancing at the typed text from his assistant, a final reminder of the room number for that critical meeting. He tried to focus on the negotiated terms they'd discuss, but his mind kept wandering to a sense of restlessness he couldn't name. The corridor stretched in front of him, and he strode forward, lost in thought, not noticing the details around him. As fate would have it, Nicole stepped out of her cabin at the same time, heading to pick up extra towels for the boys from a nearby storage area. She kept her gaze on a small notepad where she'd scribbled a list of items she still needed. Her hair was slightly disheveled from putting the kids to bed, and she moved quietly so as not to wake them if they were drifting off. They walked toward one another, the gentle hum of the ship's engines in the background. A staff member rolled a cart of linens between them, forcing each to move aside. The moment passed in an instant, and neither looked up. Jared continued down the corridor, phone buzzing. Nicole glanced at her watch, anxious to return to the twins. They got within a few steps of each other, still wrapped up in their own worlds, then kept going in opposite directions without a second glance. The air around them felt charged, though neither could say why. The ship's soft overhead lighting flickered momentarily, but neither noticed that either. From a distance, Jared and Nicole passed each other in a corridor, too absorbed in their own thoughts to notice. The air sparks with unrecognized tension. Their worlds are about to collide. Nicole awakened the next morning with a lingering sense of unease, as if some strange dream had tried to pull her into the past. She lay still for a moment, listening to the gentle hum of the ship's engines through the cabin walls. The twins were still asleep, sprawled across their beds in matching positions that never failed to make her smile. Yet her mind kept returning to that brief instant the night before, when she swore she caught a glimpse of someone familiar in the corridor, someone who made her heart do a quick, uneasy flip. It must have been a trick of the dim lights, she told herself. There was no way he could be here. By the time the boys stirred and rubbed the sleep from their eyes, Nicole had pushed the thought aside. She urged them out of bed and into fresh clothes, promising a buffet breakfast brimming with fruit, pancakes, and pastries. As they hurried to get ready, she neatly gathered last night's scattered socks and folded them into the drawer. Though she wore a practiced, calm expression for the twins, a small knot remained at the back of her mind. They made their way through brightly lit corridors to the breakfast area, following the tantalizing aroma of syrup and cinnamon rolls. The place was filled with the happy chatter of other families, and the twins gazed at each new sight with an eager curiosity that gave Nicole a swell of pride. This trip had been everything they'd hoped so far, adventures waiting around every corner. She guided them through the buffet line, helping them pick out balanced meals. For each waffle drizzled with chocolate sauce, she made sure there was a piece of fruit on the plate too. On the far side of the same dining hall, Jared sat with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. His mind raced as he scanned an early morning email about the changed schedule for tonight's meeting. His key business partners were docking at the next port, and he was supposed to finalize some major points. A wave of frustration washed over him. It felt like every plan he made got shuffled at the last minute. He glanced at his watch and realized he'd better grab something to eat if he didn't want a rumbling stomach interrupting the negotiations later. He rose from his chair and hurried toward the buffet just as Nicole finished helping the twins. One of the boys, insisting he could carry his own plate, nearly collided with Jared. Fortunately, Nicole was quick enough to catch the child's arm, steering him away before an embarrassing spill. Jared noticed a sudden flurry of movement and murmured a polite apology to whoever he'd almost bumped. But by the time Nicole turned her head, he had moved on, disappearing into the crowd. The morning bustle seemed to have swallowed him whole. Nicole found a small table near a window where sunlight splashed in a warm patch on the floor. The twins devoured their breakfast, enthralled by everything from the clink of silverware to the glimmering ocean beyond the glass. Nicole took a few bites, but her appetite was half-hearted. She couldn't shake that odd sense of having just narrowly missed something important. After breakfast, the boys begged to check out the pool again, and Nicole, reluctant to tamp down their enthusiasm, agreed. As they scurried ahead, she hung back, phone in hand, dialing her best friend back home. She hadn't meant to get so emotional so early in the morning, but when her friend's familiar voice answered, she felt tears threatening to sting her eyes. "Sorry, I'm just a little rattled," Nicole said quietly, stepping into a quieter corner near a potted palm tree. "Everything's fine, I keep feeling like I'm seeing ghosts." Her friend pressed for more details, but Nicole offered only half answers, not wanting to dwell on old regrets. "It's silly," she insisted. "I'm letting my imagination run wild." Her friend urged her to enjoy the cruise and maybe open her heart a tiny bit to the idea of new beginnings. Nicole smiled at the suggestion, though her mind was nowhere near ready to think about that. She hung up, slipping the phone into her purse, then hurried to catch up with the twins. On the main pool deck, the sun was already shining brightly, and the boys leapt around in their bright swim trunks. Nicole found a lounger and settled in to watch them, making sure they stayed within arm's length of the shallow end. There was a bar nearby serving tropical drinks, and she thought about grabbing a fruit smoothie. Just as she worked up the courage to walk over and order one, a tall man in a crisp shirt strolled up to the bar, phone pressed to his ear, frustration lining his face. For a split second, Nicole glimpsed his profile and her chest constricted. That jaw, that posture. It couldn't be. She closed her eyes briefly, collecting herself. When she opened them, the man was gone, leaving only a sense of déjà vu in his wake. Meanwhile, Jared was heading inside, phone call completed, mind still buzzing from the news his business partners were arriving earlier than planned. He was supposed to finalize the location for their evening meeting by noon, but conflicting messages had him pinned down like a chess king in check. The usual confidence he carried felt shaky. He reminded himself that everything was under control. He was too good at what he did to let a few logistical hurdles trip him up. Back in his suite, he found a fresh email confirming the arrival time. His main associate, a sharp-minded woman who rarely let anything slide, noted that the wrong room number had been attached to their official itinerary. Jared sighed, making a mental note to rectify the cabin numbers. He scribbled them down on a piece of paper, determined not to confuse them further. Then he double-checked his business folder. Little did he know how one typo could lead him directly into a confrontation with the life he'd left behind. That afternoon, The twins discovered a small arcade and game room below deck. Nicole's attempts to limit spending were put to the test as they eagerly tried out every machine. She handed them tokens one at a time, with gentle reminders that these cost real money. Guilt flickered in her chest. She wanted them to have fun without worrying about finances, but she also needed to be careful. Eventually, she steered them out of the arcade, promising they could return another day, perhaps for just a bit longer. All the while, Jared's business associates arrived, towing suitcases and important documents. He met them in a shipboard lounge where they discussed the potential for expanding into international markets. The possibility of a lucrative partnership hung in the air, yet Jared found it difficult to focus. Something about this trip made him unsettled, as though a part of him was on guard, sensing a major shift he couldn't quite articulate. The afternoon wore on, and both Nicole and Jared ended up on the top deck around sunset, drawn by the promise of fiery oranges and pinks streaking the sky. Nicole leaned on the railing with the twins, pointing at seabirds swooping low. Jared stood on a different part of the same railing, phone in hand, talking in hushed tones about the final details for the meeting. Neither noticed the other's presence. The ocean breeze carried echoes of conversations and laughter that faded into the crashing of distant waves. Later that night, Nicole tucked her kids into bed, reading them a short, whimsical story about a sea captain discovering a hidden island. The boys giggled at the funny voices she used, and their eyelids grew heavy with each passing page. Once they were asleep, Nicole brushed back their hair, thinking again about how much they reminded her of their father, though she tried not to dwell on that. The memory of those days felt like a bruise that had never fully healed. In his suite, Jared wandered the corridors one last time before turning in. He gazed at the slip of paper in his hand with the meeting details, a hastily written cabin number circled in ink. He had just gotten off a call with his assistant, who confirmed tomorrow's schedule. They had also texted him about verifying the assigned suite for an informal nightcap with the partners. Jared nodded, assured he had the right location. But the quiet voice in the back of his mind wondered if everything might somehow go wrong. Before he could second-guess himself, he checked the small watch on his wrist. It was late, but he felt compelled to finalize a few points. If that meant stepping into a cabin meant for business, so be it. He strode purposefully down the hall, rehearsing a short speech in his head about the synergy of their new partnership. His footsteps sounded loud against the muted carpet, and the hum of the ship's engine vibrated all around him. His heart quickened, not with fear, but with that familiar rush of adrenaline he always felt before closing a deal. If only he knew what waited behind that door. He approached, raised his fist, and took a breath to steady himself. Late at night, Jared confidently marches toward a cabin door, Nicole's, with the number scribbled on his note, about to knock and step in without suspecting anything. Jared turned the doorknob with quiet confidence, a folder tucked under his arm. The corridor behind him hummed with the distant sounds of air conditioning and the faint murmur of late-night conversations. He was sure this was the correct cabin for the informal business discussion his assistant had arranged. The lights inside were dim, but he stepped forward anyway, expecting to find his colleagues wrapped up in negotiations or reviewing documents. Instead, the first thing he noticed was a pair of small sneakers lying by the entrance. Children's sneakers. That was odd. This was supposed to be a VIP cabin. He glanced around, puzzled, taking in the narrow bunk beds and a scattering of colorful toys on the floor. Confusion gave way to a slowly dawning sense of alarm. Perhaps his assistant had sent him to the wrong number. Before he could pull back, a figure bolted upright in one of the bunks. Nicole. She didn't scream at first. She just blinked at him, startled, as if trying to make sense of this intruder standing in her doorway. In the muted light, Jared could see the mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness flicker across her face. "Get out!" Nicole demanded in a low voice, jumping from the bed. She raised a hand to shield the nearest twin who was stirring awake at the sound of her voice. Her heart hammered in her chest. Instinctively, she put herself between the stranger and her sons. Jared opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came. The cabin's faint overhead light fell across her features, and he stopped breathing for a moment. He knew her face, even though so many years had passed. He knew those eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she clutched at her heart when startled. It couldn't be. Nicole's shout gained volume now that she registered exactly who had burst in. She ushered the boys behind her, her expression turning from confusion to fury. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "How dare!" She trailed off, and they stared at each other, the tension between them impossibly thick. She tugged the blanket up to cover one child's shoulders, her protective gesture revealing everything he'd never known. Jared could feel the blood pounding in his ears as he realized the small form peeking over Nicole's arm was a child. And not just any child. A boy with unmistakably familiar features. One of the twins rubbed his eyes and blinked at the tall stranger. "Mom, who's that?" he asked, confusion tugging at his sleepy voice. His brother sat up too, squinting through the haze of the cabin's low light. Nicole gestured for them to be still. "It's nobody, sweetie. Just someone who came to the wrong room." Her voice trembled slightly, belying her words. Jared stood motionless, fumbling for something to say. He recalled every excuse or explanation he'd prepared for his business partners, but none of that applied now. This was Nicole, the woman he'd vanished from years ago, leaving behind a swirl of unspoken promises. And here she was, with two blonde boys who looked startlingly like a younger version of himself. The gravity of the situation dawned on him in a dizzying rush. His chest constricted, and he took a step back, but the cabin door swung shut behind him, making the space feel even smaller. He raised a hand, trying to explain. "Nicole, I didn't know you'd be here. I had no idea." She glared at him, eyes brimming with equal parts hurt and rage. "Keep your voice down," she hissed, tossing a frantic glance at the boys. "I can't believe this." He swallowed hard, looking from her to the children. They seemed groggy with sleep, but alert enough to sense their mother's panic. One of them looked directly at Jared with an uncanny curiosity. It was like peering into a mirror from the past. The older twin yawned. "Mom, is it morning?" he asked, yawning again. "Is something wrong?" "No, honey," Nicole soothed, softening her tone for her son's sake. "Everything's fine. Go back to sleep." But everything was far from fine. Jared's head spun with questions he couldn't quite shape into words. Were these boys truly his children? How old were they? 7, maybe. That would match the timeline from when he left for that business trip and never returned. A cold sweat broke out along his hairline as realization sank in. Nicole shook her head, forcibly guiding Jared back toward the door. "I want you gone," she whispered, her voice tight with desperation. "Now!" He let her push him outside into the corridor, too stunned to resist. She quietly shut the door, then turned to face him, the muted hallway lights revealing every ounce of anger on her face. "You have no right," she said through gritted teeth. "No right to barge in here in the middle of the night." "I'm sorry," Jared managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "This was a complete mistake. I thought I was heading to a business meeting and then—" Nicole's eyes flashed. "A mistake? That's one way to put it." She looked ready to unleash years of pent-up words, but then she glanced at the closed cabin door, remembering her kids were just a few feet away. A security guard appeared at the far end of the hallway, alerted by Nicole's raised voice. He approached with caution, eyeing Jared's expensive attire and Nicole's trembling frustration. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, arms folded over his chest. Nicole crossed her arms, inhaling sharply. "We're fine. This passenger came to the wrong room, that's all." Jared nodded, still somewhat dazed. "Yes, completely my fault." The guard gave them both a skeptical look, but Nicole's fierce expression dissuaded him from prying further. "Very well, ma'am," he said politely, then turned to Jared. "Sir, let's keep noise levels down. Other families are trying to rest." Jared nodded again, absently adjusting his collar. "Understood." With that, the guard left, though he glanced back once more with a suspicious tilt of his head. As soon as he was gone, Nicole pressed her back against the closed cabin door, arms wrapped protectively around herself. She looked at Jared like she wasn't sure whether to scream or cry, or both. "How did you even get on this ship?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "After all these years, why now?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no immediate answer made sense. In truth, he was reeling. He had never expected to see her again, let alone discover she had two boys who might be his. He took a deep, ragged breath. "I came for a business deal," he said quietly. "I didn't know you were here. I swear, I didn't." Nicole shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "Well, congratulations," she said bitterly. "You got exactly what you wanted, right? Your deals, your success, everything you chased after when you left me behind." Jared's stomach twisted into knots. He wanted to deny it, to protest that he never intended to abandon her. But the hallway lighting cast stark shadows across her face, and he could see the pain there, etched by years of struggling alone. I didn't know," he repeated lamely, voice wavering. "I didn't know about them." She pursed her lips, silent for a moment as though she might say something else. Then she shot him one last devastating glare before stepping inside. "Just stay away," she spat, closing the door firmly in his face. He stood there for a moment, staring at the polished metal of the door handle, his thoughts tangling in frantic circles. Then he heard a soft footstep behind him. His assistant had come looking for him, confusion written across her face as she took in his disheveled state. "Sir? What happened? The others are waiting in the lounge. Are you all right?" He forced a nod, turning and walking away from Nicole's cabin with heavy steps. The assistant followed, asking questions, but he wasn't ready to answer. His mind was consumed by the image of those two small boys and how much they looked like him at that age. Back in his own suite, he locked the door and collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Memories of Nicole, the warmth of her laughter, and the promise he'd once made to return all crashed over him. He hadn't kept that promise, and now she might never forgive him. He took a shuddering breath, recalling how the twin who'd woken up stared at him with the same curious brown eyes Jared saw in the mirror every morning. Sleep refused to come. Each time he closed his eyes, he imagined those children, how they might have grown from tiny infants to the bright-eyed boys he glimpsed tonight. And all he could hear was Nicole's trembling voice telling him to stay away. He couldn't just walk away from them, not this time. His assistant texted, asking if he was all right. He glanced at his phone but didn't answer. 1,000 questions battled in his mind. Where would he even begin to make amends? For years, Nicole had apparently raised the twins alone. Anger, guilt, and a fierce surge of protectiveness swirled together, leaving him feeling off balance. As dawn crept closer, he still hadn't closed his eyes. The city lights in the distance sparkled across the water. "They might be mine," he whispered, voice echoing faintly in the quiet cabin. The thought both terrified and electrified him. He stood by the window, looking out at the endless dark sea, knowing his life had just changed forever. "They look exactly like me." Morning light crept through the edges of the curtains in Jared's suite, revealing dark circles beneath his eyes. He had drifted off only for moments here and there, haunted by the vision of Nicole's shocked face and the sight of those twin boys who looked so much like him. When the sun finally rose, he gave up on sleep altogether and left his cabin for a walk around the deck, hoping the crisp sea air would bring him some clarity. He found a quiet spot near the ship's bow where few other passengers ventured at such an early hour. Leaning against the railing, he stared at the shimmering waters and wondered how his world had flipped so suddenly. Just days ago, his main concern had been sealing a business deal. But now he couldn't think about anything except the lives he might have hurt by being absent. He had no plan for how to talk to Nicole, how to ask if the boys were truly his, yet he knew he couldn't hide from her. Not anymore. Across the ship, Nicole woke with a pounding headache. She'd slept in fitful bursts, replaying Jared's stunned expression when he saw her children. Part of her wanted to believe he'd been genuinely unaware of her pregnancy, but another part was still furious, convinced that his ambition had always overshadowed his feelings for her. Pushing her tangled hair aside, she rose and checked on the twins, who were already awake and chattering about breakfast. Their youthful energy offered no room for her lingering sorrows. "Mom, can we go get pancakes now?" asked one boy, practically bouncing on his bed. His brother nodded in vigorous agreement, tugging at the edge of her t-shirt. Nicole forced a faint smile. "Yes, but let's get dressed first. Don't forget to brush your teeth." Her headache throbbed, but she focused on the simple routine of caring for her sons. That always gave her a sense of purpose, a reminder that she wasn't the same person Jared had walked out on years ago. She was a mother now, fierce and protective. A short while later, she hurried them out of the cabin, hoping to beat the breakfast crowds. The boys raced each other down the corridor, and she had to raise her voice to keep them from bumping into other guests. Turning a corner, she froze. Jared was there, on his way back from the deck, looking pale but determined. Their eyes locked for a split second. He started to speak, but before any words came out, Nicole grabbed each twin by the hand and swerved past him, mumbling under her breath for him to leave them alone. She didn't want a scene in front of her children. The boys glanced at Jared curiously, but Nicole kept moving before they could ask questions. Jared watched them disappear around the corner, his heart sinking. He could still see how one of the twins' curious gaze lingered on him, like a half-recognition. That momentary spark pained him more than he cared to admit. Sighing, he tucked his hands into his pockets and made his way back to his suite, trying to prepare for a conference call with his business partners. But the conversation turned into a blur of market projections and contract clauses. His mind refused to focus. He kept picturing Nicole's face, the tight set of her jaw, and the way she'd protectively steered the boys away. Later that morning, Nicole found a moment to slip into one of the ship's restrooms alone while the twins were at a supervised kids' activity. She locked herself in a stall, bracing her palms against the smooth walls, letting out a shaky breath. A wave of memories washed over her. The night Jared announced he'd be leaving for a short-term opportunity, the tears she held back when he promised he'd return soon, and the mixture of heartbreak and anger when weeks turned into months without so much as a call. She never wanted to feel that helpless again. Now, seeing him stand there, looking as unsettled as she'd ever seen him, reopened wounds she thought had scarred over. By midday, the sun was bright above the ship's top deck. Crowds gathered near the pool, children laughed, and staff offered drinks decorated with little umbrellas. Nicole tried to avoid Jared, but they seemed doomed to cross paths on a vessel with limited hiding spots. Eventually, Jared caught her stepping out onto a quieter section of the deck. He stood near the railing, blocking her path. "Nicole," he said, voice raw. "Please, I just want to talk." She paused, back stiffening. "Why would I talk to you? I think we've both said enough already." He swallowed, his gaze flicking to a passing couple who eyed them curiously. "I'm sorry. I don't want a public scene either. Can we step aside for a moment?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to ensure the twins weren't around. Satisfied they were safely occupied elsewhere, she nodded grudgingly and followed him to a shaded corner near some lounge chairs. The ocean stretched out in every direction, their only witness the distant line of the horizon. "Nicole," he began, resting his hand lightly on the railing, "I need you to know I had no idea about them." Her eyes blazed. "How convenient. You leave me without a word, never check back, and then you show up claiming ignorance. It's too late for that." He shook his head. frustration evident. I never meant for things to go this way. That night I got called away on a project that seemed like a life-changing opportunity. I kept telling myself I'd call you once I was settled, but everything spiraled. I was traveling constantly, the investors were demanding. 1 week stretched into another, and I'm not proud of what I did. I just didn't realize. I never knew you were pregnant, I swear. She laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. And you think that excuses you? That if you'd known, you might have done the right thing? I was alone, Jared. I handled everything while you were off building your empire. His face contorted with regret. I don't want to make excuses. If I could turn back time, I would. But now, are they mine? A fresh wave of anger flickered in her expression. They are mine, she said icily. I don't know if I want them to be yours at all. You lost that claim when you walked away from me. He exhaled, shoulders slumping. I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But you can't expect me to vanish again now that I know. I can't just pretend none of this happened. Nicole's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Don't you dare! Don't you dare start talking about fatherly responsibilities when you've been absent for 7 years. The boys don't know you, and they're perfectly happy without you. He wanted to reach out, to offer some small comfort, but he could see in her trembling stance how close she was to unraveling. I never got the chance to be anything else, he whispered. I'm sorry. She turned her head away, silently composing herself. Well, maybe you should have thought of that before you vanished. Her voice was brittle. Now I don't know how to protect them from having their hopes shattered. I won't let you hurt them like you hurt me. The words struck him harder than he cared to admit. He tried to speak again, but she brushed past him, ending the conversation. For a moment he watched her vanish into the crowds, feeling the sting of failure, the weight of all he'd missed. He wanted to chase her, to tell her how much he regretted not reaching out. But a gathering of curious onlookers, sensing the tension, lingered nearby, and he couldn't muster the energy to face their questions. Nicole returned to her cabin, where the twins were now resting, chattering about the activities they'd just enjoyed. She mustered up her best smile for them, but inside, her heart felt heavy. She wished she could freeze time, protect her sons from the storm that Jared's reappearance had unleashed. Although she hated to admit it, part of her still felt a pang of nostalgia for the man she once believed he could be. That evening, as the moon rose and gentle waves lapped against the hull, Jared found himself alone near the ship's stern. The flickering lights of a distant shore twinkled across the dark water. Leaning on the railing with the wind ruffling his hair, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in his high-powered business life. He stared into the rolling black sea, mind spinning with guilt and longing. Tightening his grip on the railing, he gazed at the horizon and spoke softly, as if making a vow only the night would hear. I'm going to prove I deserve to be in their lives. The next morning, Nicole woke with her heart still pounding from the argument the night before. She tried to push the memory aside. Jared's sudden reappearance, the words they'd exchanged, the undeniable look of guilt in his eyes. Her priority was to keep life as normal as possible for her 7-year-old twins. They needed a vacation without dark clouds looming overhead. She forced a cheerful expression and roused the boys, helping them get ready to see the ship's activities for the day. Mom, can we go back to the water slide? One twin asked, bouncing on his toes as soon as he was dressed. The other nodded. Yeah, it's the best part of this ship. Nicole mustered a warm smile and ruffled their hair. After breakfast, okay? We'll get you guys some pancakes first. They trooped into the busy corridor, and Nicole kept her gaze forward, half expecting Jared to appear at any moment. She hurried the boys along, determined not to let them see the tension she felt in every muscle. When they arrived at the buffet, the twins raced to pick up trays while Nicole scanned the room warily. No sign of him. She exhaled, feeling both relief and a strange pang of disappointment she couldn't quite explain. At a table nearby, two passengers whispered animatedly, throwing glances toward Nicole and the twins. She caught snatches of their conversation. "I'm sure it's him, the CEO. Looks just like—" Her breath caught in her throat. Did they mean Jared? And were they already speculating about the children? The boys were too busy stacking pancakes on their plates to notice, but Nicole felt a spark of anger in her chest. She ushered them to a quieter corner of the dining hall and tried to pretend none of it bothered her. Before long, she set the twins up with their breakfast, and they happily dug in. She poked at her own food, her appetite dulled by nerves. Not far away, Jared listened to his assistant's urgent whispers, phone in hand. Apparently, a rumor had started circulating among some of the passengers. The well-known CEO on board might be entangled in a paternity scandal. Jared's business partners had also heard about it. They sent him wary messages, worried that negative press could sink their million-dollar deal. His grip tightened on the phone. The last thing he wanted was for Nicole or the twins to become fodder for gossip. He hadn't even confirmed the truth himself. Still, he was no stranger to rumors and paparazzi. He knew how vicious they could be. He tore his eyes away from the phone when he glimpsed Nicole guiding the boys to a corner table. She looked tired, shoulders stiff. Guilt flared in him again. He wanted to fix this, but he also had to be cautious. For now, he decided to sit on the opposite side of the buffet, giving her space. Meanwhile, one of Nicole's twins began to complain of a mild earache. Concern flashed across Nicole's face. She quickly cleared their plates and brought them to the ship's medical office just to be safe. The doctor examined the boy and reassured Nicole it was nothing serious, likely just a bit of pressure from the change in altitude and the sea breeze. Still, she couldn't help feeling protective. She thanked the doctor and led the boys out. On their way back, a few passengers cast curious looks at Nicole. A couple even snapped pictures with their phones. One had the nerve to call out, "Is that the famous businessman's kid?" Nicole felt her cheeks burn. She hurried the twins along without responding. She reached her cabin and shut the door, fighting the urge to slam it. The boys, sensing her tension, asked if she was mad. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, crouching to their level. "I'm just trying to keep everything calm." They accepted her answer, though they still looked worried. Feeling torn, she decided to let them rest for a bit. She put a cartoon on the small television to occupy them while she stepped into the hallway for a brief phone call. Her best friend picked up after the first ring. "Tell me you're enjoying yourself," the friend teased, but then heard the tremor in Nicole's voice. Concern replaced the playful tone. Nicole swallowed back tears as she recounted Jared's shocking reappearance and the gossip swirling around the ship. "I was hoping for a peaceful vacation," she whispered, glancing at the closed cabin door, "but now it feels like everything is upside down." Her friend listened, offering calm reassurances, reminding Nicole she was a strong mother who had raised the twins on her own. "And if he's truly their father," her friend said gently, "maybe he wants to do right by them now. If nothing else, this might be your chance to let go of the anger. Not for him, but for you and the boys." Nicole sighed. "That's easier said than done." They said goodbye, and Nicole pressed her phone to her heart, closing her eyes in the hallway. She knew she couldn't avoid Jared forever, nor could she hide the twins away. But how to shield them from the painful spotlight? Later that afternoon, the sun was high and the decks were alive with laughter. The twins begged to return to the pool, insisting they felt perfectly fine. Nicole relented, on the condition that they avoid the deep end. She found a couple of lounge chairs and watched them from the edge, feeling a slight sense of ease as she saw them squeal and splash without a care in the world. It was a small reminder of why she'd chosen this trip in the first place, to bring joy to her children. While the boys played, whispers continued around the pool area. Nicole could sense eyes on them, and she overheard mutters like, "He has to be the dad," or "The resemblance is uncanny." Each word felt like a thorn jabbing at her nerves. Jared arrived not long after, having just gotten off a tense call with one of his investors. He spotted Nicole, seated with sunglasses perched on her nose, arms crossed over her chest in a defensive posture. The twins were in the water, oblivious to the quiet storm of gossip swirling around them. Jared wavered, unsure whether to approach. In the end, he hovered nearby but kept his distance, reading the signals that Nicole wasn't ready for more confrontation. Then, a curious older woman emerged from the pool, adjusting her goggles, and struck up a conversation with Nicole about the twins. In a well-meaning but forward manner, she mentioned seeing them around the ship. "They're just adorable. And they look so much like that handsome CEO fellow. You must be—" Nicole's jaw clenched. She cut the woman off with a polite but firm smile, offering no details. As the woman walked away, Nicole felt the back of her neck prickle with anger. She glanced around and found Jared's gaze locked on her from across the deck. For a moment, their eyes held a silent plea, neither wanting this spectacle, neither knowing how to stop it. By late afternoon, the tension had ramped up enough that Nicole decided to retreat. She called to the twins, promising they'd come back for more pool time tomorrow. They traipsed behind her, drying off and yawning. She guided them down a corridor toward the elevator that would take them to a quieter dining area for an early dinner. That was when she spotted someone aiming a small camera in their direction, pretending to fumble with a cell phone. She hurried the boys into the elevator, heart pounding. Was it her imagination, or was someone actually following them? That evening, after dinner, she tried to keep the twins entertained with a simple board game in the cabin. Their cheerful banter soothed her, but a nagging worry lingered. Suddenly they heard a commotion outside. She peered through the peephole and saw a cluster of people in the hallway, each trying to get a glimpse of something or someone. Deciding it was safer to stay put, she kept the door locked, focusing on a bedtime story for the twins. Her stomach twisted with anxiety over how quickly rumors can escalate. Around 9 o'clock, she took the boys for one last walk near the deck. The moonlit ocean was calmer now, and many passengers had retired to bars or lounges. It was in this quieter moment that Nicole thought she could finally breathe without worry. Just a mother with her children, enjoying the rolling waves. That was when a flash of light made her jerk backward. A small pop sounded, like a camera shutter. A stranger, holding what looked like a tourist's camera, stood a few feet away, snapping photos in rapid succession. She caught the glint in his eyes, excitement at having caught her off guard. Her mind registered the shocking reality. This was no accidental souvenir photo. It was aimed directly at her and her twins. A paparazzo disguised as a tourist snaps a photo of Nicole and the twins. The flash startles Nicole, who realizes their private lives may soon be fully exposed. The very next morning, Nicole's phone lit up with a series of messages from her best friend back home. Each one was punctuated with exclamation points and concerned emojis. Confused, Nicole stepped into the small bathroom of her cabin for privacy and opened the links her friend had sent. One led to a social media post featuring a photo taken the previous night. Nicole standing on the deck with her sons, a bright camera flash illuminating their surprised faces. The headline declared, "Mystery woman and her twins linked to elite CEO aboard luxury cruise." Her heart pounded as she scrolled through the post. Comment after comment speculated that the boys belonged to Jared, the wealthy businessman rumored to be on the same ship. Some online sleuths had already matched the children's faces to Jared's childhood photos, which circulated among fans of financial gossip columns. Nicole felt nauseous. She had tried so hard to keep her kids out of the spotlight, and now strangers on the internet were picking apart their resemblance to a man they'd never even known. She jumped at a sudden knock on the bathroom door. The twins were calling her name, asking if she was all right. Forcing a steady breath, she slipped the phone into her pocket, stepped out, and mustered her best reassuring smile. "I'm fine," she said softly, giving them each a gentle hug. They didn't need to see those headlines. They deserved to be children, free of the world's prying eyes. But the ship's energy had changed. At breakfast, Murmurs followed Nicole everywhere. A few bold passengers snapped pictures from their phones, pretending to focus on something else. Nicole lowered her gaze, steering the twins through the crowded buffet line, wishing she could shield them with an invisibility cloak. "Mom," one boy whispered, tugging her sleeve, "why are people looking at us like that?" She pressed her lips together. "They're just curious," she answered softly. "Ignore them, okay?" He nodded uncertainly, but confusion clouded his face. His brother clutched Nicole's hand, as if sensing something was wrong. Jared, meanwhile, had awakened to the same viral posts, forwarded by his frantic assistant. He saw the photos, read the speculative comments, and felt his stomach lurch. His business partners, well aware of the rumors swirling online, now pressed him to take control of the narrative before negative press ruined their delicate deal. They demanded a statement, one that would deny paternity or confirm it as long as it halted the brewing scandal. Leaning against the wall of his suite, Jared raked a hand through his hair. He couldn't stomach the thought of publicly denying the twins. But how could he confirm anything if Nicole wouldn't even speak to him? If he said they were his without her blessing, he risked pushing her away entirely. Torn between his obligations and his conscience, he left his assistant's calls unanswered, stuffed some documents into a portfolio, and headed out in search of Nicole. He found her in the corner of a lounge area, where she was trying to calm one of the twins. The child looked upset and a bit pale, perhaps reacting to all the unwanted attention. Nicole had them seated at a small table away from staring eyes. She glanced up the moment Jared approached, and her expression darkened. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to make a scene," he said, keeping his voice low. She got to her feet, sending the twins to the other side of the lounge to watch an aquarium display. Then, crossing her arms tightly, she turned to Jared. "Look what you've done," she hissed. "They're all over the internet now, and I can't even take them to breakfast without people gawking or snapping pictures." Anger and guilt flared in Jared's eyes. "I never wanted this," he answered, matching her low tone. "The photos leaked before I could do anything about it." "Really? And I suppose your fancy business deal isn't your top priority anymore?" Her voice dripped with bitterness. He winced. "I'm not here to talk about the deal. I'm here to figure out how to stop this from hurting you and the kids." Nicole's gaze flicked to where her sons were standing, huddled close. "If you want to help, then convince everyone to leave us alone. Or just get off the ship, vanish into the wind again like you did before." Jared clenched his jaw. "I can't leave. You know why?" She shook her head, eyes burning. "I'm done talking, Jared. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to keep my children safe." He tried one last time. "Nicole, please." But she brushed past him, calling the boys over and taking them swiftly toward the exit. Onlookers had begun whispering again, phones angled at them in a not-so-subtle manner. Jared rubbed the bridge of his nose, frustration building. He grabbed his phone, opening the camera roll to revisit the photos from last night's fiasco, feeling a surge of anger at the invasive paparazzi. By midday, the rumor mill had only grown louder, fueled by the new pictures. Several entertainment sites ran gossip headlines about Jared's secret family and whether child support was in question. Nicole, knowing the twins couldn't ignore the whispers forever, told them gently that some people thought they resembled a man on the ship, but it was all just rumors. One boy asked if they did look like that man, and Nicole had to choke down her emotions, trying to keep her answer vague. That afternoon, Jared attempted to do damage control by speaking to some onboard staff. He requested that the photographers be restricted or reported for harassment. Unfortunately, the ship's administration admitted they had little control over passengers taking personal pictures, which could be sold to tabloids once they docked. Furious and helpless, Jared realized only a firm public statement might quell the frenzy. But any statement would drag Nicole and the boys into the spotlight even more. As the sun began to set, Nicole decided she'd had enough. She visited the front desk to inquire about disembarking at the next port. The staff told her that arrangements could be made, but it might be complicated. The abrupt nature of her request posed logistical challenges with customs, and the cost for an early departure wasn't negligible. Still, she felt corners of her mind screaming that this was the only way to protect her children. They didn't need the constant stares, the million questions, and the possibility of Jared trying to push back into their lives for all the wrong reasons. That night, in the corridor outside her cabin, Nicole ran into Jared again. He looked pale, as if the day's events had squeezed every ounce of calm out of him. "I heard you're planning to leave," he said, voice tight. "Please don't. Let's talk this through." Her frustration boiled over. "You just want to salvage your reputation," she snapped. "You'll say or do anything to keep your business partners happy. Well, I'm not letting my boys become pawns for your image." Jared's eyes narrowed, although sadness lingered there too. "You really think this is just about business?" She hesitated, unable to stop her voice from shaking. "How do I know otherwise? After you vanished all those years ago, all you've done is chase your own success. And now you show up demanding a role in my children's lives, acting like you can shield them from the mess you helped create." He took a single step closer, heart pounding. "Nicole, I know I messed up. I'm not denying that. But I'm here now, and I want to help." She shook her head, cutting him off. "Stay away from me. I'll figure this out on my own." Slamming her cabin door, she sank onto the bed. The twins were in the bunk, half asleep and unaware of the adult tensions swirling around them. She touched their foreheads gently, vowing to protect them at any cost. Not far away, Jared stood in the corridor, feeling the weight of the situation crushing him. He glanced at his phone, which buzzed with calls from his investors, likely worried about the scandal. But at that moment, he didn't care about them. He couldn't lose the chance to be a father if the twins were truly his. Thunder echoed faintly outside as the ship sailed into rain-lashed waters, the sky dark and ominous. Jared peered through a nearby porthole, watching the storm gather over the ocean. The wind howled, rattling the glass. He thought about Nicole's anger, the twins' wide-eyed uncertainty, and the relentless paparazzi chasing a story. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the phone. Eyes distant, he whispered the words that had haunted him all day. "I can't lose them now." Morning arrived with an overcast sky, the horizon marked by a distant sliver of land. Nicole's decision was made. She would leave the cruise with her twins at the next port, no matter the complications or the cost. She packed hastily, folding the boys' clothes into a small suitcase while they asked questions she avoided. Their bright voices filled the cabin, talking about the ship's slides and the giant buffet they loved so much, but she couldn't allow her regret to weaken her resolve. This was the only way to protect them from the swirling rumors and the painful presence of Jared. She ushered the boys through the corridor, their rolling suitcase bumping along the plush carpet. The ship's announcement system crackled, informing passengers that they would dock soon. Nicole clutched a small stack of papers, her request for early disembarkation, signed by the ship's administration, plus some proof of identification the port authorities required. Though expensive and inconvenient, she was certain it was the right choice. She led the twins to the gangway where a few other passengers were lining up to exit briefly for shore excursions. Nicole, however, intended not to return. Her heart pounded as the line inched forward. The boys were mostly quiet, clutching her hands, though she could see a flicker of disappointment in their eyes. They'd been looking forward to more fun on board. Suddenly, one of the boys tugged her sleeve with a whimper. His face had lost its usual color, and he looked unsteady on his feet. Before Nicole could speak, he doubled over with a violent wave of nausea. Alarmed, she crouched down, pressing a hand to his forehead. It was hot. Her throat tightened. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she asked gently, trying to keep the rising panic out of her voice. The boy could only shake his head, tears forming in his eyes. Nicole felt her stomach twist. This was more than simple nerves. The line shifted, and the staff member at the checkpoint beckoned her forward. She debated forcing themselves onward. Maybe there was a medical clinic at the port. But the closer she looked at her son's pale face, the more she realized she couldn't drag him through immigration forms and a lengthy disembarkation process in this state. A wave of protectiveness overcame any plan she'd made. She scooped him into her arms, pivoted away from the line, and hurried back inside the ship. The onboard infirmary was a short walk from the gangway. By the time Nicole arrived, the boy was trembling against her, complaining of a piercing headache. The medical staff directed her to one of the examination rooms, quickly taking his temperature and asking questions about his symptoms. Nicole answered in halting bursts, trying to comfort her other son as well, who looked anxious and close to tears. Word spread quickly through the ship's grapevine, and within minutes, a tall figure appeared at the infirmary door. Jared. Nicole's heart lurched at the sight of him. She opened her mouth to send him away, but all she managed was a tense exhale. Her sick child moaned, drawing her attention back to the exam table. "What happened?" Jared asked, voice low, stepping closer. His face looked stricken with worry. Nicole's expression was rigid, though tears threatened to fall. "He got sick right when we were about to leave," she whispered, stroking her son's hair. "He's burning up." Jared set down the folder he had been carrying and moved closer, ignoring Nicole's guarded stance. The doctor ran some tests and suggested it might be a virus exacerbated by stress or exhaustion. He wanted the boy to rest and remain under observation for a few hours, at least until his fever stabilized. The hours crawled by in the infirmary. Nicole paced the tiny room, occasionally washing her hands or fetching cold compresses for her son's forehead. The other twin perched on a small chair, anxiously watching his brother. Jared lingered near the door at first, uncertain if Nicole would let him stay. But when she didn't usher him out, he approached the boy and offered a hesitant, comforting smile. The child blinked up at him, confused but too tired to protest. Once the doctor stepped out to fetch medicine, Jared gently took a cup of water and pressed it to the boy's lips, encouraging him to sip. Nicole watched from the corner, arms folded, her protectiveness warring with the faint gratitude that she didn't have to handle this alone. After what felt like an eternity, the fever broke. The doctor confirmed that the boy was stable enough to leave, but advised more rest and minimal stress. Nicole let out a shaky sigh of relief, tears glinting in her eyes. For a moment she turned to Jared, feeling that everything she carried alone had become unbearably heavy. While the doctor wrote instructions on a notepad, Jared bent down to the child's level. "You scared us for a minute, buddy," he said softly. The boy looked at him with sleepy eyes, and Jared held the water cup again, helping him drink. Nicole stood a few steps away, arms still crossed but posture less rigid than before. "You should take him back to your cabin," the doctor advised gently. "Keep an eye on his temperature and give him these drops if it spikes again." Nicole nodded, aware that the chance to leave the ship at the port had passed. The gangway was closed to new departures, and she realized her child's health took absolute priority. Maybe it was foolish to run from everything. Maybe she had to deal with this situation in a more direct way, even if that meant letting Jared stick around for a while longer. The small group headed out of the infirmary. Nicole carried a slip of paper with the medical instructions, and Jared held the door. Her other son hovered between them, glancing from one adult to the other, as if gauging whether it was finally safe to relax. In the quiet corridor, they all seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. No paparazzi, no stares, just the lingering hush of midday on a giant ship. Jared hesitated, then placed a hand on the sick child's back, guiding him gently. "Lean on me if you're dizzy," he murmured. Nicole watched this from a pace behind, her heart tugged in conflicting directions. She'd told herself Jared was selfish, that he'd never step up, but the genuine concern on his face and the tenderness in his voice suggested something else entirely. She remembered how abandoned she'd felt years ago, but she also couldn't deny that he was here now, trying with every step to be present. They walked as a small, tentative unit, each of them all too aware of the uncertain road ahead. Nicole felt her guard slip just a fraction, enough to let her see that maybe Jared wasn't purely the ruthless CEO she had convinced herself he was. Maybe beneath all the business suits and crisp manners, he was a man who regretted what he'd missed more than he could say. Drained from the emotional whiplash and lack of sleep, Nicole wondered if she was strong enough to handle the storm raging inside her. The children, though, came first. She would do anything for them, even accept help from the man who'd once shattered her life. If he kept showing this genuine care, she might have to reconsider the rigid walls she'd built for so long. With calm steps, they left the infirmary, the young boy's arms loosely around Nicole's waist while Jared steadied him from the other side. No reporters or curious onlookers crowded them now. It was just the four of them in a quiet passageway, united by relief that the worst seemed over. The hush felt almost sacred, as if the ship itself understood how delicate this moment was. As they leave the infirmary, Jared places his hand gently on the child's shoulder. Nicole sees genuine love in his eyes, and for a flicker of a moment, her defenses waver. Morning arrived with a gentle knock on Nicole's cabin door, one of the ship's staff announcing the doctor's follow-up for her son. She thanked the crew member quietly, turning to see the twins already awake. The boy who had fallen ill appeared much better, though still a bit pale. She wanted to be sure he was cleared for any activities and free of lingering fever. Her other son hovered near his brother, relieved to see him looking more alert. They made their way through the corridor, and Nicole kept a protective arm around the recovering twin. Yesterday's turmoil still weighed heavily on her, but she pushed the worry aside to focus on her child's health. They entered the ship's infirmary, where the same doctor greeted them with a kind smile. After a brief checkup, temperature, a glance at the boy's eyes, a question or two about how he was feeling, the doctor nodded approvingly. The fever had fully subsided, and it seemed the worst was over. Outside in the hall, they nearly bumped into Jared. He had come to ask the medical staff for an update. The concern etched on his face looked all too genuine. The moment his eyes landed on the recovering child, a flash of relief passed over his features. "How's he doing?" he asked gently, falling into step beside them. Nicole hesitated, then answered with grudging civility. "He's better. The doctor just cleared him." Jared gave the boy a warm smile. "That's great news. You must be starving. Think you can manage some breakfast?" The child nodded shyly. Nicole noticed how her son seemed neither afraid of Jared nor entirely comfortable yet, more like a cautious curiosity. Slowly, she realized it might be helpful if Jared came along, at least so the twins wouldn't feel the same tension that had filled the air since he'd reappeared. So, when Jared offered to guide them to a quieter dining area, she said nothing in protest. They found a small restaurant on one of the upper decks, less crowded than the main buffet. Jared managed to secure a corner table by the window where sunlight streamed in on the polished wood. Nicole settled the boys on one side while she and Jared sat on the other. A few heads turned, curious to see the mother and twins who had been the talk of the ship, but fewer cameras pointed their way here. One of the twins, the healthier one, asked for chocolate milk, eyes bright with excitement. The other boy, though not entirely recovered, managed a small smile when Jared made a silly face, mimicking the slow, hungry approach of the pancake monster. For a brief moment, a flicker of normalcy graced the group. Nicole felt a pang in her chest watching Jared amuse the children. She fought back a swirl of conflicting emotions, bitterness for the years she'd raised them alone, anger that the rumors had overshadowed the vacation she'd scrimped and saved for, and a guilty hint of relief that Jared was finally stepping up, if only for a short time. She couldn't decide which feeling was stronger. As the meal unfolded, Jared's phone buzzed on the table. He flipped it over, ignoring the call. Then it buzzed again, lighting up with a short series of urgent messages. He exhaled, an unspoken apology in his expression, and stepped away for a moment to address his business partners, who were no doubt panicking about the swirling gossip. Nicole noticed the tension in his face before he walked off. She tried to tune out his hushed conversation, but phrases like negative press and postponing the announcement drifted through the air. She couldn't help listening, her heart sinking at the confirmation that Jared's deal still loomed over everything. When Jared returned to the table, she couldn't keep the frost from her tone. "Sounds like your big business arrangement is causing you trouble." He offered a tight nod. "They're concerned about the rumors," he admitted, careful to keep his voice low so the children wouldn't hear. "But none of that matters to me right now." Nicole raised an eyebrow. "Really?" A corner of her mind recalled him disappearing the first time, chasing a life-changing opportunity. Yet he now spoke as if he'd placed the kids above all else. She wanted to believe him, but years of self-defense told her to be cautious. He glanced toward the twins, who were whispering among themselves and giggling. "Yes," he murmured. "I know it's hard to trust me, but I'm trying to do better." She swallowed, unsure how to respond without revealing how much he had hurt her. Instead, she changed the subject, turning to the children. "If you both feel up to it, we can stroll around the deck for a bit. No running, though," she admonished, eyeing the child who had been sick. He nodded obediently. They left the restaurant, stepping into a quieter part of the open deck. The ocean stretched out in serene blues and whites, the sky a clearer shade than the overcast day before. The twins rushed to the railing, though Nicole tugged gently on the hand of the one still recovering, making sure he didn't overexert himself. The warm sea breeze brushed against their faces, carrying laughter from distant parts of the ship. A small group of passengers ambled by, casting glances and whispering among themselves, but no one outright harassed Nicole or the children. She was grateful for this temporary calm. Jared took the twins aside to point out a flock of seagulls diving toward the waves, talking with them in a low voice. They stared, fascinated, occasionally bursting into laughter when a bird snagged a fish. Nicole watched from a few steps away, her heart caught in a mixture of yearning and guardedness. Soon, one of the ship's entertainment staff approached with a bright smile, handing out flyers for a kids' water activity, a small obstacle course in the shallow pool, complete with floating platforms and silly games. The twins immediately brightened, eyes shining with excitement. Nicole hesitated, not wanting to push her recovering boy too hard, but he looked up at her with pleading eyes. Jared knelt beside him. "Are you sure you feel up to it? We can just watch if you'd rather." "I feel good," the boy said, with more energy than he'd shown all morning. Nicole gave in, deciding they could at least check it out. And so, they ended up at the pool deck where other kids were gathered, shrieking and giggling as they balanced on the floating obstacles. Nicole settled into a lounge chair, crossing her arms. She kept a hawk-like gaze on the twins, determined to step in if they showed any sign of exhaustion. To her surprise, Jared removed his shoes and rolled up his pant legs. He carefully entered the shallow water, assisting the boys as they wobbled on the first foam platform. It was almost comical, this polished CEO awkwardly balancing on kiddie floats, yet beaming at the children. The boys squealed in delight every time they made it to a new platform. Other parents glanced over, amused and intrigued by the sight of a man who clearly wasn't accustomed to navigating inflatable obstacle courses. But Jared seemed determined to keep the twins safe and laughing. Nicole felt a twinge of an unexpected smile at the corner of her mouth, watching them from the edge. She remembered how Jared had once been the life of any room he entered, cracking jokes and making her feel as if nothing mattered except the moment they shared. Could he really be that same person? It hurt to recall how easily he'd vanished from her life. Yet there he was, letting the children use his arms for support as they giggled and stomped on a floating mat. When the kids eventually tired out, Jared helped them back to the side, lifting them gently over the pool's edge. Their hair dripped water, and wide grins revealed how much fun they'd had. Nicole stepped forward, wrapping each child in a dry towel. She nodded her thanks to Jared, acknowledging his effort, though she kept her expression guarded. He nodded back, water trickling off his pant legs. Before she could speak, Jared's phone buzzed again. He quickly silenced it, but not before Nicole glimpsed the name of his top investor flashing on the screen. She sighed, turning to guide the boys away. The brief moment of harmony was overshadowed by the realization that Jared's world of business demands never really went away, no matter how sincere his intention to be present. Late that evening, after dinner, Nicole led the twins back to their cabin for bedtime. The day's events had worn them out, and they fell asleep quickly. She tucked them in, placing their stuffed animals within reach, then watched their peaceful faces. Despite the turmoil, they had found moments of genuine happiness. As she turned to organize the cabin, she noticed a small envelope slipped under the door. Her heart clenched. Curiosity warred with dread as she crouched to pick it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed headline from a gossip website, "Shocking Secret Air Scandal on the High Seas." A grainy photo showed Nicole, the twins, and Jared side by side at the pool. Red arrows highlighted the boys' features, linking them to the CEO's known childhood pictures. A lump rose in her throat. She couldn't escape it. No matter how intimate or gentle the moments with Jared and the twins felt, the outside world insisted on intruding, spinning their story into a spectacle. As Nicole tucks the kids in, she finds a note slipped under the door. Paparazzi pictures splashed across an online article with a headline announcing, "Shocking Secret Air Scandal on the High Seas." Nicole paced in her cabin, gripping the printed article that had been slipped under her door. The salacious headline glared at her in bold letters, "Shocking Secret Air Scandal on the High Seas." Every detail, her face, Jared's silhouette, and the twins' striking resemblance to him, was captured in grainy snapshots. The words on the page felt like an unstoppable force dragging her deepest secrets into public view. Her first impulse was to tear the paper into shreds, to deny the rumor's power over her life. But the truth weighed heavily. She couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. Despite wanting to shield her boys from the world's relentless gaze, the rumors had already reached a boiling point. She sank onto the small couch, pressing a hand to her forehead. Outside, the steady hum of the ship's engines seemed louder than usual, like a low chorus to her restless thoughts. Even though the twins slept peacefully in the bunks, Nicole couldn't find any semblance of calm. For their sake, she forced a breath and tried to regain control. A soft knock broke the stillness. She opened the door a crack to find Jared standing there. He looked tense and conflicted, as though he'd spent the last hour debating whether to come. "I saw the article," he said quietly, stepping in just enough so they could speak without waking the children. "This is getting out of hand." She let out a shaky exhale. "That's putting it mildly." He glanced at the bunks. The boys were curled under the blankets, oblivious to the storm raging around them. Turning his attention back to Nicole, Jared lowered his voice. "My partners, they're pushing me to make a public statement. They think if I stay silent, it'll only fuel more speculation." Nicole's lip trembled with anger. "So you want to deny them, publicly?" He shook his head vehemently. "No, I can't do that. I won't. But I also can't claim them without your permission. I'm stuck." Her throat felt tight. She remembered all the times she'd laid awake, wishing he would come back and at least acknowledge his child. Children, as it turned out. But now that he was here, everything felt more complicated than the day he'd left. "You think some press conference will magically fix this?" she asked, bitterness creeping into her voice. "You'll just stand there, tell the world these kids might be yours and expect it to blow over?" Jared's gaze flicked to the bunk bed again. "I don't expect it to blow over. I'm just trying to protect them. If we don't address it, the rumors get worse. People will say whatever they want, and the kids will be hounded." For a moment, they stared at each other in the soft glow of the cabin's nightlight, the hum of the air conditioning filling the silence between them. Finally, Nicole closed her eyes. "I don't like this, but I don't have a better plan." He nodded, something like relief in his expression. Tomorrow I'm going to call a press gathering in one of the ship's event lounges. Just a handful of journalists, hopefully. I'll say the truth, that there's a strong possibility they're mine. Nicole's hand trembled on the doorknob. And what if the kids get dragged into it? Cameras, questions. I'll insist they're not to be interviewed or photographed, and I won't reveal anything private about you or them, just an acknowledgement so we can stop the speculation. She scoffed softly. You think you can control the media that much? No, he admitted, but it's better than letting them run rampant with their own conclusions. Nicole pressed her lips together. She hated the idea of any statement, but hated the current chaos even more. Fine. Do what you have to. I won't attend. She tried to close the door, but Jared gently stopped it. I'm truly sorry, he whispered. I never wanted any of this. I just want to do right by you and them. A moment of raw pain flickered in her eyes. We'll see, she said, then shut the door. The next morning, Nicole woke to the twins stirring, excited about a new day on the ship. She kept her face composed, trying not to betray the whirl of anxiety in her stomach. If Jared was going to make a public announcement, it would likely happen around midday when the press had set up. Nicole longed to keep the children as far from the cameras as possible, but she couldn't hide them away in the cabin forever. After breakfast, she guided the boys to a small activity room where staff offered games and arts and crafts. They were thrilled to try out painting and clay modeling, giving Nicole a short window to slip away and check if Jared had indeed gone through with his plan. Part of her wished he'd back out, but she knew he wouldn't. A swirl of curiosity, dread, and reluctance pulled her along the corridors toward the main event lounge. Sure enough, she reached the doors to find a small knot of reporters and curious passengers gathered inside. Microphones stood at the front of the room, and Jared, tall, eyes set with determination, was speaking quietly with a staff member. He held a folded piece of paper, likely notes for the statement he intended to read. For a moment, Nicole lingered by the entrance, half hidden behind a taller passenger. She didn't want to be seen, but her heart hammered with the need to know what he would say. Perhaps she owed it to herself and the twins to hear his words firsthand. Jared stepped up to the small podium, clearing his throat. The whispers in the room died down. Bright lights from camera phones and a couple of actual cameras focused on him, casting sharp shadows across his face. The expression he wore was serious, tinged with vulnerability. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone used to speaking under pressure. "There's been speculation that I might be the father of 2 young children on this ship. Until now, I've said nothing, but the rumors have grown invasive and hurtful to the family involved." A flicker of annoyance passed through the group of reporters, as if they braced for a typical denial. But Jared continued in a firm, measured tone. "I want to make it clear that there is a strong possibility these children are mine. Although I've only recently learned of their existence, I take full responsibility for my past mistakes." He paused, swallowing, and Nicole could see the tension in his shoulders. "Until paternity is confirmed, I ask for privacy and respect for the mother and the children. None of them deserve the scrutiny or speculation that's been forced upon them." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Flashbulbs popped, capturing Jared's composed but emotional statement. One bold reporter in the front row raised her hand. "Are you claiming them publicly because of your business deal? Is this just to protect your company's image?" Nicole's heart clenched. This was exactly the kind of question she'd feared. Jared looked the reporter straight in the eye. "No. My business deal is secondary. This is about doing what's right for a potential family I never knew I had. The children come first." A hush fell over the room as he finished. Another reporter asked if he planned to undergo a DNA test. Jared nodded, acknowledging that step would come soon. Then he glanced toward the door, toward where Nicole stood, half hidden in the shadows, pulse thrumming in her ears. Their eyes met for an instant. In that, Nicole watched from the back of the event lounge, half concealed behind a taller passenger. Jared stood at the podium, shoulders squared, speaking into a cluster of microphones. A hush had settled over the small crowd of reporters and curious onlookers. The last camera flash faded, and stillness held the room. "I want to make it clear that there is a strong possibility these children are mine," Jared declared, glancing down at the paper in his hand for just a heartbeat. "Although I've only recently learned of their existence, I take full responsibility for my past mistakes. Until paternity is confirmed, I ask for privacy and respect for the mother and the children. None of them deserve the scrutiny or speculation that's been forced upon them." A ripple of surprise passed through the gathering. Some reporters had clearly expected a denial. Others scribbled hurried notes. One raised her hand, stepping closer. "Are you making this statement because of your multi-million-dollar business deal? Is it just damage control?" Nicole felt her stomach clench at the question. This was her exact fear, that Jared was only stepping forward to preserve his reputation. She could see from his tense expression that he recognized the weight of his next words. He locked eyes with the reporter. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do," he replied, voice calm. "Yes, I'm also negotiating a significant business partnership, but my priorities shifted the moment I realized there might be 2 children out there who need their father." Murmurs spread across the lounge. A few cameras flashed again, capturing the earnest set of his jaw. Another reporter asked about DNA testing. Jared confirmed that step would come as soon as logistically possible, given they were at sea. Then he glanced toward the entrance. For a fleeting moment his gaze found Nicole, half hidden in the shadows. The intensity in his eyes seemed to steady him, as though her presence reminded him whom he was truly doing this for. A tall man in a crisp polo shirt, clearly a photographer, shouted from the back, "So you admit you were a deadbeat dad until the tabloids outed you?" Jared's jaw tightened. "I admit I made mistakes. I never knew Nicole was pregnant. But that's not an excuse. I should have kept in touch. If it turns out these boys are mine, I'm committed to making up for lost time." A sea of questions swelled. People clamored for details, some wanting to know if he planned to pay child support, others demanding the mother's identity. Jared held up a hand, calmly stating he would disclose no personal information about Nicole or the twins to protect their privacy. He politely thanked everyone for respecting that boundary and stepped away from the microphones. 2 ship security staff moved in to manage the crowd. Nicole felt her heart pounding as the lounge erupted in a flurry of camera clicks and urgent whispers. She slipped out quietly, eager to avoid being caught in the wave of attention. The last she saw, Jared was shaking a few reporters' hands while politely refusing further comment, his expression grim but resolute. She made her way back to the corridor, where she stopped by a large porthole. Sunlight streamed through onto the polished floor. Her hands trembled as she placed them against the cool metal railing, trying to collect her thoughts. Even though she'd strongly resisted the idea of a public confession, something about hearing Jared speak so openly tugged at her heart. Lost in thought, she almost didn't notice him approaching. He had managed to extract himself from the reporters and now stood a few steps away, looking shaken by the intensity of the press conference. Nicole turned to face him, uncertainty simmering in her eyes. "Did you hear everything?" he asked quietly, wiping perspiration from his brow. She nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "Yes," she said, voice taut with emotion. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually go through with it." He let out a tired breath. "Honestly, neither was I. But I meant every word. I can't pretend those boys aren't my responsibility." He paused, catching himself. "Our responsibility, if you'll let me." She studied him for a moment, grappling with her own doubts. "People are still going to talk," she murmured. "They'll want interviews, pictures. They won't let this go easily." "I know, but if we stand together we can control the narrative or at least protect the kids," Jared answered softly. He hesitated, then added, None of this matters if you won't have me anywhere near them. I don't want to force my way in." Nicole took a moment to peer out the window, the ocean's vast expanse reminding her how small their problems might seem in the grand scheme of things. Yet they consumed her world entirely. She turned back to him, arms folded. "I still have a hard time trusting you. I'm so angry. I raised them alone, Jared." He lowered his head. "I know. And if they're mine, I can never repay you for that." When he lifted his eyes again, she saw raw remorse there. "All I can do now is try to be the father they deserve. This press conference was just a start, a way to keep the rumors from exploding." In that moment, a few straggling reporters emerged from the lounge, looking around the corridor for more stories. Jared stepped closer to Nicole, angling his body protectively as he noticed their cameras. One reporter lifted a lens in their direction, but Jared gave a slight shake of his head, silently warning them off. The reporter seemed to think better of pressing further and drifted away. Nicole's chest tightened. What happens next? Jared took a small step forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "That's up to you. I'd like to meet the twins formally, somewhere quiet so we can talk without an audience." She considered it, her mind flashing to the boys' wide grins at breakfast, how oblivious they still were to the swirling media frenzy. Part of her wanted to seal them off from everything, but a deeper part admitted they deserved answers. She nodded stiffly. "I'll think about it." He started to speak again, but she cut him off with a weary gesture. "Jared, I'm overwhelmed. Please, just give me some space." He bowed his head in understanding. "Of course, I'll let you go. But just know I meant what I said. This is about more than business for me." His voice wavered, then firmed. "I'm ready to be their father if you'll let me." Before she could muster a response, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone by the porthole. She closed her eyes, the ship's gentle sway nearly making her dizzy. The events of the day replayed in her mind. His public confession, the reporter's barrage of questions, the glimpses of sincerity she'd caught in his eyes. It was almost too much to process. She glanced at the article still clutched in her hand, the headline screaming about a secret scandal. With a sigh, she folded it carefully, as if hoping to tuck away the chaos it represented. Folding her arms over her chest, she walked toward her cabin, every footstep echoing in the corridor. As she neared the door, a soft voice of doubt whispered that Jared might only be doing this to avoid losing his multi-million-dollar deal. Another part of her argued that he'd shown genuine emotion that no cold-hearted businessman could fake. Both halves fought in her head, leaving her unsure which to believe. Finally, she reached the cabin, pausing before she turned the handle. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, and she rested her forehead against the door, remembering the hush that fell when Jared admitted to the cameras that he might be the father. Could he truly be doing it all for her and the twins, risking his own business reputation? She entered quietly, finding the twins drawing pictures on the floor. They looked up, beaming. She forced a smile, ruffling their hair as she settled onto the small couch. Their questions about the press conference would come eventually. For now, she let them show off their doodles of dolphins and colorful sunset skies. As the ship's overhead speakers announced evening events, she realized how little time was left for secrecy. Rumors might keep growing. Maybe Jared had the right idea, to face it head-on rather than wait for it to explode further. She glanced at the bunk beds, imagining how different life could be if she accepted his help. But could she handle it if he broke their hearts? Outside, the corridor quieted, and the twins began to tire. She tucked them in for the night, whispering lullabies she had made up during her years of single motherhood. Then she slipped into the hallway to stand alone, thinking about the day's ordeal. The hush felt like a fragile gift, giving her space to breathe and reflect. She noticed Jared approaching from the opposite end, no reporters in sight this time. He looked as though he wasn't even sure if he should come closer, yet something in her gaze must have drawn him in. He took a tentative step forward, waiting for her to say something. all the questions burning in her mind condensed into a single moment of truth. She swallowed hard, recalling every word from his public confession. Taking a breath, she met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you really doing this for us?" Nicole stood in the corridor, arms folded, eyes flicking from Jared's uncertain expression to the softly lit doorway of her cabin. The muffled sounds of her twins stirring within seemed to punctuate the silence. Her question still hung in the air. "Are you really doing this for us?" Jared inhaled slowly. He looked tired, darker circles under his eyes, tension pinching the corners of his mouth. Yet there was a warmth in his gaze that made Nicole's heart flutter with a conflicting mix of hope and wariness. "Yes," he said softly. "I won't pretend I'm not worried about my business deal, but if it all fell apart tomorrow, I'd stay here with you and the boys. That's where my priorities are." She studied him, her guard still firmly in place. For so long she had raised her children alone, nursing anger and resentment. To trust him again felt like stepping onto shifting sand. She opened her mouth to reply but found no words, only a tightness in her chest. Instead, she nodded once and gestured for him to follow her into the cabin. The twins were sitting up in their bunk beds, yawning and rubbing their eyes. Seeing Jared enter, they exchanged curious glances, as if uncertain how to greet him. Nicole stood beside them, smoothing the rumpled sheets. "He wants to talk to you two," she murmured. Jared approached slowly, heart hammering. He crouched to be at eye level. "Hey guys," he began, voice gentle. "I know you've seen me around the ship, and I'm sure you've heard things. People saying I might be your dad." The boys looked at each other, then back at him. One of them fiddled with a small stuffed dolphin, the other clutched the edge of the blanket. The first spoke with a shaky curiosity. "Are you?" he asked, eyes big and uncertain. Jared swallowed. He glanced up at Nicole, who offered no rescue. This was a conversation only he could navigate. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I want to find out. More important, I want to be here for you, both of you. Whether I'm your dad or not, I care about you." A quiet settled in the cabin. The children looked to their mother, seeming to read the tension in her posture. Nicole's expression remained guarded, but a flicker of tenderness passed across her face. She gently placed a hand on each twin's shoulder. "I know you have questions," she said. "I do too. But for now, he's going to spend some time with us, if that's okay." The boys nodded, one braver than the other. "Can he come with us to the top deck later?" the bold one asked. "There's a big family event there today." Jared's shoulders relaxed a fraction, and a hint of a smile touched his lips. "I'd love to, if your mom says it's all right." Nicole could hardly believe this was real. She remembered the bitter tears she'd cried after his abrupt departure years ago, how she'd learned of her pregnancy alone, how she'd worked 2 jobs at times to keep things afloat. Yet here he was, offering the one thing she'd once yearned for him to give. No apology could erase the past, but maybe a genuine effort in the present could mend the future. "Fine," she said quietly, feeling her own heartbeat steady. "Let's go see what kind of family event they've planned." A short while later, the 4 of them stepped onto the upper deck. Music played through the loudspeakers, and a mini carnival-like atmosphere reigned near the central pool. Children lined up for face painting, while parents sipped tropical fruit drinks. Colorful streamers twisted in the sea breeze, and staff members dressed as friendly mascots danced to upbeat tunes. Nicole watched the twins dart forward to investigate a booth offering balloon animals, but this time they both looked back to make sure Jared followed. He did, smiling like he couldn't quite believe he was part of it all. Nicole hung back a moment, letting them have space. She couldn't ignore the stares some passengers gave, although the presence of cheering families made it easier to blend into the lively scene. Turning her eyes to the horizon, she exhaled, letting the ocean wind clear her thoughts. Perhaps it was time to let go of the anger chaining her heart, not for Jared's sake, but for herself and for the children. A flash of a camera reminded her that rumors still lurked. Yet she saw that Jared's press conference had at least changed the tone of people's whispers. They watched him guide the twins to a game booth, exchanging laughs and earning tickets for small prizes. Instead of prying eyes, some onlookers gave them gentle smiles, as if moved by the notion of a separated family coming together. Nicole felt a hush of gratefulness. It wasn't perfect, but it was calmer than before. When the twins insisted on trying a ring toss game, Jared knelt beside them, demonstrating how to angle the small rings for the best chance. The younger twin flung a ring that soared off in the wrong direction, prompting giggles. Jared fished a token from his pocket for another try, unwavering in his patience. Nicole found herself smiling too, a warmth spreading through her as she saw how naturally Jared coached them. Finally, the boys scampered off to exchange their game tickets for prizes. Nicole stepped closer to Jared, her voice just loud enough to be heard over the music. "Thank you," she said. "I never expected you to jump in like this." His eyes flicked to hers, bright with emotion. "I'm just trying to show you I'm serious," he said. "I know it'll take more than a day of games." She swallowed. "It will. But this is a start." They lingered by the railing, content to watch the twins compare their little toys, cheap plastic figures that meant the world to them. A staff member on a microphone announced there would be a brief gathering in 15 minutes at the deck stage, some kind of awards for the day's activities, followed by a short reception. Families gathered in groups, and Nicole felt the twins tug at her hand, wanting to get a good spot near the front. Suddenly, Jared's phone vibrated in his pocket. He frowned, glancing down, recognizing his business partner's number. A wave of tension crossed his face. Nicole caught it and tensed, bracing for him to walk away. Instead, he silenced the call and slipped the phone back in his pocket, ignoring the insistent buzzing. Then he turned to Nicole and the boys. "I'll deal with that later," he murmured, gazing at them. "This is more important." A quiet spark of gratitude lit Nicole's chest. They made their way toward the small stage where families bunched together in anticipation. A mild hush fell as a staff member began calling up children to award them small medals or ribbons for winning silly games throughout the cruise. The twins cheered on the older kids who trotted up the stage. Jared and Nicole stood side by side, sharing a short glance that carried so many unspoken things. At the end of the presentations, one of the organizers took the microphone to thank everyone for making the Family Day event such a success. A handful of cameras from the ship's staff captured pictures for the cruise souvenir album. The twins clapped excitedly, asking if they could see their own pictures later. Jared ruffled the younger boy's hair, smiling in a way Nicole had never seen before, content, proud, and vulnerable all at once. Then, just as the crowd began to disperse, Jared gently caught Nicole's wrist. Something in his face hinted at a decision made. He cleared his throat, looking suddenly unsure of himself. "Can I talk to everyone for a second?" he asked the staff member with the microphone. There was a ripple of curiosity among the small gathering. Nicole's heart skipped. She wasn't sure what he intended, but the staff member handed him the microphone, stepping aside graciously. Jared inhaled, the once dominant CEO now resembling a man bearing his soul in front of strangers. He began by thanking everyone for the welcoming spirit on the cruise, especially for the kindness shown toward two young boys who'd become very special to him. With a slight tremble in his voice, he apologized for any chaos caused by rumors and paparazzi. The crowd listened quietly, some exchanging curious whispers, others sympathetic. Finally, he turned to face Nicole and the twins, microphone trembling in his grip. "I spent too many years chasing success, and it led me away from someone I cared about," he said, voice catching. "I don't want to lose any more time. I know I've made mistakes, but you..." His eyes brimmed with emotion. "You and these boys deserve my best, and I'm ready to give it." Nicole felt tears at the corners of her eyes. The twins clung to her, glancing around with wide-eyed wonder, not fully grasping the gravity of the moment. Jared handed the microphone back, turning to them. In a gesture of pure vulnerability, he dropped to one knee, though not exactly in a romantic proposal stance. It was more like a promise, a pledge that he'd be there. "I don't know if we can start over or how this journey goes," he said, looking up at Nicole. "But I'll do whatever it takes to build a real family with you, if you'll give me that chance." For a moment, it felt as though the entire deck held its breath. The children gazed at their mother, unsure if they should cheer or laugh or cry. Nicole stood frozen in raw emotion, tears finally escaping. In that instant, she remembered all the lonely nights, all the unfulfilled wishes that the father of her children might reappear. To see Jared publicly declaring he wanted a life with them, she never saw that coming. She knelt beside him, heart pounding, and touched his face softly. "I'm scared, but I'm willing to try," she managed, voice shaky. The twins let out little whoops of excitement, hugging each other and then clinging to their mother's side. The onlookers broke into applause, some snapping pictures, but the moment felt strangely private, as though only the four of them existed. Jared stood, pulling Nicole into a brief embrace, then stooped to place a reassuring hand on each twin's shoulder. They looked at him, eyes shining, finally realizing that maybe, just maybe, they had a father willing to be in their lives. Later, after the applause died down and the crowd dispersed, news reached Jared that his investors had decided to continue with the deal, evidently touched by his genuine display of priorities. He seemed almost relieved, yet oddly indifferent. He had found something far more important than money or corporate praise. They stayed on that deck until sunset, the four of them leaning on the railing, watching the ocean shimmer. For the first time in years, Nicole felt an unfamiliar optimism growing inside her. The path ahead wouldn't be simple, but at least they were stepping onto it together. As the cruise finally docked, Nicole and Jared stood at the railing, arms around the twins. Nicole breathed in the sea air, reflecting that true wealth isn't found in money, but in the love and unity they have finally rediscovered. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.